the early hours of January 20th, 2008, Reno, Nevada was quiet. Snow rested on sidewalks and rooftops, softening the usual city noise. Porch lights stayed on through the night, casting a low, steady glow over empty streets. Most people were asleep in their homes, unaware that a few miles away, something was going terribly wrong. It felt like a safe night, the kind where nothing unexpected happens. Brianna Dennison was asleep on a living room couch in a house she knew well. She was staying with friends. The door was locked. The area was familiar. Everything about the situation suggested she was safe. She hadn't taken risks. She hadn't wandered off alone. She was supposed to wake up in a few hours and go to class, continuing a routine she'd already built for herself. And yet, sometime before morning, that sense of security disappeared. There were no sounds of a struggle, no alarms. No one in the house noticed anything out of place. When the sun came up over Reno later that morning, Brianna Dennison was no longer there, taken from a place where nothing was supposed to happen at all. Before her name appeared in news reports or court records, Brianna Michelle Dennison was a 19-year-old college student still figuring things out, like most people her age. She was born on March 29, 1988, and raised in Nevada by a close, supportive family. The people who knew her best described her as thoughtful and kind, someone who paid attention to others and meant what she said. She wasn't loud or attention-seeking. She listened, and when she spoke, it was clear she cared. At the University of Nevada, Reno, Brianna was studying psychology. She was interested in how people think and why they behave the way they do, especially when they're struggling. Friends said she had a steady, calming presence that made it easy to talk to her. She was careful, responsible, and very loved by the people around her. Like many students, Brianna balanced school with a part-time job, friendships, and the everyday pressures of young adulthood. She laughed easily, showed up for people, and was just beginning to imagine what her future might look like. In January 2008, she had been staying with friends at a house on McKay Drive, a quiet residential street close to campus. It wasn't unusual. College friends stayed over all the time, especially during winter, when late nights and cold weather made it easier to just sleep where you were. The house was familiar, comfortable. It had been full of conversation and noise earlier that night. To Brianna, it felt safe. What happened next had nothing to do with the choices she made or the kind of person she was. She wasn't singled out because she stood out or because she knew someone dangerous. She crossed paths with someone who didn't know her at all, someone who noticed an opportunity and acted on it. That randomness is one of the hardest parts of this case to accept. Brianna wasn't chosen for any reason beyond circumstance. And during the quiet hours before morning, her life collided with someone whose actions would end it. Abruptly and senselessly, cutting short everything she had been building toward. Saturday, January 19, 2008, started out normally. Brianna spent the day doing what a lot of 19-year-olds do, juggling school responsibilities and enjoying the small freedoms of being young. That night, she went out with friends to celebrate a birthday. There was music, conversation, and laughter. Nothing wild, nothing that stood out. When the night started to wind down, Brianna made a practical choice. Instead of driving home late in the cold, she went back with friends to the house on McKay Drive. She knew the place well. She had stayed there before. It felt like the safest option. After midnight, the house grew quiet. Lights went off, doors were locked, people headed to their rooms. Brianna settled onto the living room couch, wrapped herself in a blanket, and went to sleep. She expected to wake up in a few hours, grab her things, and pick up right where she'd left off. Sometime between 3 and 4 a.m., that night changed, without anyone inside the house noticing. Investigators believe a man approached the home while it was dark. There was no sign that a window had been broken or a door forced open. Nothing suggested a loud struggle. No one sleeping inside heard anything. That quiet matters. Whoever entered the house moved carefully and deliberately. Brianna was taken from the couch while she slept. She didn't have time to call or text anyone. Her phone stayed behind. Her shoes were still where she had left them. When the person responsible left the house, Brianna Dennison was gone, taken from a locked home in a quiet neighborhood, leaving behind no visible mess, only the sudden absence of someone who should have been there. Morning arrived slowly. Sunlight came through the windows, alarms went off. People began to wake up, but Brianna wasn't there. At first, no one panicked. They tried to make sense of it. Maybe she had left early, maybe she'd gone somewhere nearby. But as time passed, concern began to build. Her belongings hadn't moved. Her phone went unanswered. Nothing about her disappearance made sense. By midday, worry turned into fear. Police were called, and what began as a missing person report quickly took on more urgency. Officers searched the house and the surrounding area. Friends retraced their steps from the night before, hoping something small had simply been overlooked. There was no simple explanation. What became clear was that Brianna hadn't wandered off, and she hadn't chosen to disappear. Something had been done to her, and the realization that followed would soon ripple far beyond that house on McKay Drive, shaking an entire community. Once police were called, everything changed. This was no longer about someone running late or forgetting to check in. Brianna Dennison had disappeared in a way that didn't add up, and with every passing minute, the concern grew more serious. Officers began at the house on McKay Drive, moving through it carefully, room by room. Nothing looked out of place. Furniture hadn't been moved. There were no broken windows, no damaged doors, no signs that anyone inside had been startled awake. Brianna's phone was still inside. Her purse was untouched. Her shoes were exactly where she had left them. To investigators, that stood out immediately. People don't leave without their phone or shoes, especially in January, and especially not without telling anyone. The search spread outward from the house. Officers checked nearby streets, alleyways, and open areas. Friends went back over the night before, replaying conversations and movements, hoping they'd overlooked something small that could explain her disappearance. They came up empty. As hours turned into days, the effort expanded. Flyers appeared across Reno. Volunteers joined law enforcement, searching rural land, ditches, and stretches of open terrain outside the city. Local news broke into regular programming, and Brianna's photo began appearing on televisions throughout northern Nevada. Her family waited, holding on to hope while bracing for what they feared might come next. 3 days later, that fear became reality. On January 23, 2008, Brianna Dennison's body was found in a remote area near Hidden Valley, southeast of Reno. The location was far from campus, quiet, isolated, and rarely visited. The discovery confirmed what investigators had been increasingly worried about. Brianna had been killed. The news spread quickly. The university reacted almost immediately. Vigils were organized. Some classes were canceled. People who had never met Brianna mourned alongside those who knew her well. What unsettled many wasn't just that she had been murdered, but the circumstances surrounding it. She hadn't been out alone late at night. She hadn't been somewhere unfamiliar. She had been asleep inside a locked home. For a lot of people, that reality changed how safe they felt. Investigators now faced a different urgency, not just understanding what had happened to Brianna, but finding the person responsible and figuring out whether they were still out there. At that point, the search was no longer for Brianna. It was for whoever had taken her life. With the search over and the case now officially a homicide, detectives returned to the house on McKay Drive with a new focus. They knew something important had happened there, that even if it hadn't been obvious at first. Not every crime scene looks violent. Some leave very little behind. Forensic teams carefully examined the living room where Brianna had been sleeping. The couch, the floor, the nearby furniture. Everything was documented and checked methodically. Each surface was inspected under strong lighting, one section at a time. That's when they noticed it. A single shoe impression. It wasn't easy to spot. It wasn't tracked across the floor or left in dirt. Instead, it appeared faintly on a piece of furniture near the couch. Once investigators saw it, though, there was no mistaking what it was. The shoe print didn't belong to anyone who lived in the house, and it didn't belong to Brianna. Investigators photographed it, took measurements, and preserved it as evidence. The tread pattern stood out. It wasn't common, and it was detailed enough to be useful. It was the first clear indication that someone else had been inside the home. At the location where Brianna's body was found, investigators worked just as carefully. The area was documented thoroughly, and forensic teams collected biological evidence that allowed them to develop a DNA profile of an unknown suspect. For the first time, the case had direction. Someone had entered the house. That person had left a shoe impression, and DNA linked them to the crime. But without a name, the evidence only raised more questions. Detectives began comparing the DNA profile to existing databases. They reviewed timelines, looked for similar incidents, and went door to door in nearby neighborhoods, asking residents if they had noticed anything unusual in the early hours of January 20th. Then, investigators received a report that shifted the case. Another woman came forward. She described an attack that had happened just days earlier. Like Brianna, she had been taken in the early morning hours by a stranger she didn't know. Unlike Brianna, she was released and survived. Her account immediately stood out. She provided details about how the attack unfolded, giving investigators insight into the suspect's behavior. More importantly, DNA collected from her case matched the same unknown profile found in Brianna's. That connection changed everything. What initially appeared to be a single crime was now part of a larger pattern. Someone was moving through Reno during the early morning hours, targeting strangers and leaving behind very little evidence. But not none. With a matching DNA profile, a distinctive shoe print, and a surviving victim who could describe the attack, investigators finally had solid ground to stand on. They weren't guessing anymore. They were getting closer. As investigators worked quietly, life in Reno began to feel different. News of Brianna Dennison's disappearance, followed by the confirmation of her death, spread quickly. What unsettled people most wasn't just the violence of the crime, but how random it was. She hadn't been out walking alone. She hadn't put herself in danger. She had been asleep inside a locked house. For students at the University of Nevada, Reno, the case felt uncomfortably close. Classes went on, but focus was harder to keep. Parents checked in more often. Friends made a point of walking together, even during the day. Porch lights stayed on overnight. Doors were locked, unlocked, and checked again. Police increased patrols in residential areas, especially near campus. Detectives asked residents to report anything that seemed off, even if it felt minor. In a case like this, they explained, small details could end up mattering. Inside the investigation, there was another concern driving everything: whether it could happen again. The DNA connection between Brianna's case and the earlier assault confirmed it wasn't a one-time event. The person responsible had attacked before, and there was no guarantee he wouldn't do it again. That knowledge added pressure to every move investigators made. Detectives went back through older reports, suspicious activity, attempted break-ins, early morning encounters involving women. They compared timelines, mapped locations, and looked for patterns that might show where the suspect spent time or how he chose his targets. The surviving victim's account became especially important. Her description of the attacker's behavior, calm, controlled, deliberate, suggested someone who planned carefully and relied on catching people off guard. At the same time, forensic analysts continued running the DNA profile through databases. Some leads went nowhere. Others raised hope, only to fall apart. The community waited. With no arrest, fear lingered. Each night felt longer than the last. Then, in mid-February, investigators finally got what they'd been waiting for. A DNA match came back, with a name. The break investigators had been waiting for came quietly. A DNA match. After weeks of testing and comparisons, the unknown profile connected to Brianna Dennison's case was finally identified. It belonged to a man living in Reno, James Bila, 27 years old. Up until that point, he hadn't drawn attention to himself. Detectives moved carefully from there. They didn't make an immediate arrest. Instead, they took time to solidify the case. They reviewed his background, monitored his movements, and worked to reconstruct where he had been during the early morning hours of January 20th. What they learned raised serious concerns. Biela lived close enough to the University of Nevada, Reno, to move easily through student neighborhoods. He had access to a vehicle, and he had no personal connection to Brianna Dennison. That last point was important. It confirmed what investigators had suspected from the start. Brianna hadn't been targeted for any personal reason. She had been chosen because she was there. On February 14th, 2008, detectives made their move. James Bila was arrested without incident. To most people, it looked like a routine arrest on an otherwise ordinary day. For investigators, it marked the end of weeks of pressure and uncertainty. Search warrants followed soon after. Inside Biela's residence, officers found shoes that matched the tread pattern discovered at the McKay Drive house. The size, wear, and design were consistent with the impression found near the couch where Brianna had been sleeping. Forensic testing confirmed what the evidence already suggested. Biela's DNA matched the biological evidence recovered from Brianna Dennison, as well as from the earlier assault involving the surviving victim. For the first time, the case had a clear focus. For Brianna's family, the arrest brought answers, but it didn't bring relief. Knowing the person responsible was in custody didn't lessen the loss or the reality of what had happened. Across Reno, there was a sense of release. People felt safer, knowing the person responsible was no longer free. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was no longer abstract. It had a name, and it was headed for court. With James Bila in custody, the case moved out of the hands of investigators and into the courtroom. This phase was different. It wasn't about searching or speculation anymore. It was about laying out what had happened, step by step, in a public setting. For Brianna's family, it meant sitting through details no parent should ever have to hear. For the rest of Reno, it was the moment the case became real, in a way headlines never could. Prosecutors built their case carefully and methodically. They walked the jury through the timeline of January 19th and early January 20th. Brianna returning to her friend's house, the door being locked, and someone entering while she slept. They presented the physical evidence, the shoe impression found near the couch, the DNA recovered from Brianna's body, and how both were linked directly to James Bila. The testimony of the surviving victim was also central. Her account aligned with the forensic evidence and helped explain how the attacks happened. She described a stranger who relied on surprise and control, reinforcing investigators' conclusion that the crime was deliberate and opportunistic. The defense attempted to raise questions about timing and sequence, but the evidence was difficult to dispute. The DNA connection and the matching shoes left little room for alternative explanations. As witnesses took the stand, the courtroom was quiet. Friends and investigators described the night Brianna disappeared and the days spent searching for her. Through their testimony, the jury heard about Brianna not just as a victim, but as a person, a young woman who was careful, kind, and deeply loved. In 2009, after deliberation, the jury reached its decision. James Bila was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. He was sentenced to death. For the Dennison family, the verdict brought accountability, but not closure. No ruling could change what had happened or bring Brianna back. Her absence remained, constant and unfixable. For the community, the case left a lasting mark. It challenged assumptions about safety and forced people to confront how unpredictable violence can be, even in familiar places, even behind locked doors. When the trial ended and the courtroom emptied, the legal process was complete. But for those who loved Brianna, and for many who followed her story, the impact of her death didn't end there. It became something they would carry with them long after the verdict was read. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in real investigations, shocking cases, and justice served, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us as we explore more true crime stories.